Honestly, I couldn't think of anything good for the cold open after writing all this. Hey Steve? Yeah, can we just roll the Mac and Me clip? I've always had a penchant for the strange, supernatural, and bizarre. Hell, I dedicated an entire year of my journalism career to cataloging such things. Whether it be cryptids, ghosts, aliens, or anything in between, I've studied and read about all kinds of this stuff. Mind you, I don't necessarily believe in most of it, or all of it, but I still think these topics are at least wildly fascinating. While my area of expertise lies more so in the cryptozoology category, stories of UFOs and close encounters are a second for me, primarily because those two categories overlap at times. However, I've always approached the subject of UFOs and aliens from a more dissociated lens. Growing up in rural areas most of my life, local myths and legends focused on terrestrial monsters rather than those coming from above. My experience is one that not a lot of people grow up with, quite clearly, as UFOs and aliens are big in not just pop culture, but in world culture. No matter what country you go to, I can bet you dollars to donuts that you can find at least one or two folks with the story of some sort of unidentified flying object. And these stories don't just exist across geographical space, but time as well. Generational stories of strange things in the sky have always existed, some becoming ingrained into cultures. This is all well and good, and these stories can be interesting, but what happens when people who think they're smarter than you get a bit too big for their britches and have connections to higher-ups at the History Channel? You're probably most familiar with Ancient Aliens as being the first stepping stone in the History Channel's descent into madness, preceding their other biggest cash cow, Pawn Stars, by only 3 months. The show was the brainchild of authors and scholars David Childress, Giorgio and Eric von Daniken, proponents for the ancient astronaut hypothesis, which asserts that aliens visited Earth in days long gone and interfered with or aided humanity's development. It's kinda hard not to know at least some of the cultural impacts the show has, considering it's been on the air for 13 years now. Yep, it's been 13 fucking years since the first episode aired. The show has 18 damn seasons with 216 episodes at the time of this video coming out. And I watched every single last one of them. Why, you may be asking me? Well, it's hard to say exactly. Maybe I'm just a masochist. Maybe I like getting mad at stupid shit. Or maybe, just maybe, I'm taking my revenge on the History Channel and this godforsaken show for being the only thing available to watch while I was in the hospital for a week and a half. Who knows? What exactly am I going to do with this useless knowledge, you may be thinking? Is he going to tell us what happens in every single episode? Well, instead of giving a breakdown of each episode of every season and having you poor schmucks sit through a 12-hour-long video of me getting progressively more and more frustrated, we're gonna do things a bit differently than those who have done this sort of thing before. You see, if there's anything you should know about Ancient Aliens, it's they basically use all their material in the first season. From there on out, it's just rinse and repeat the same bullshit ad nauseum for the next 200 episodes. So instead, I have taken a page out of their book and created a useless theoretical system, the 5 Pillars of Ancient Aliens. Think of these pillars as to Ancient Aliens what the stock archetypes are to the Commedia dell'arte. Without any of them, it could still technically exist, but it wouldn't feel whole. At least one of these pillars can be found in every single episode, but mind you, I never said these pillars were good things. No, these pillars represent the worst of the worst aspects of what make up this show, the bullshit above all other bullshit, because if you thought for even a second this video was gonna be positive, you're dead wrong. It's well accepted the show is full of baloney, and I ain't debating that, but we'll get into all that stuff in the pillars. Now, with so many episodes to choose from and showing examples for these pillars, I'm going to elect to break down the first season's 5 episodes, as like I said, afterwards it's just the same shit repeated over and over again anyway. And if I'm being honest, After the 5th season or so, my notes primarily became a grocery list of expletives. But don't worry, all that time I wasted sitting in front of a computer screen won't go to complete waste for me, but you'll see what I mean later. Rather than shoving the explanation of a pillar into the segment it appears, I'll hint at them as they pop up and then review them after each episode. Think of it as a sort of pseudoscientific Blue's Clues. At the end of each episode, I'll reveal one of them, but keep an eye out in the clips for the hidden Eye of Horus, which marks the clues. For now, let's jump right into the first episode and begin wading through this hellhole of a show. The first thing I should note about the first episode of Season 1 and all subsequent episodes in this season is they are full, hour-and-a-half long documentaries, not 30 to 45 minute long episodes like in future seasons. That's another reason I'm choosing to use these as our series breakdown, because it contains the most content and therefore the most information that will be repeated later in the series. Anyway, the first episode starts with a narration and a few clips from interview segments talking about their mission statement: to show aliens came to Earth in centuries long past and handed down their almighty knowledge to ancient man. Following the intro, we get our first self-aggrandizing title card, The Evidence. Then we get our first segment of the show, centered around an artifact known as the Sakara bird. I don't know why they chose this as their first piece of evidence. Perhaps it's because it's kinda simple to explain and even easier to lie about.
Among the various items discovered was a small wooden model of what appeared to be a bird, lying beside a papyrus, bearing the inscription, "I want to fly."
Simple, right? Little wooden bird sculpture made out of sycamore. It's cute, maybe a children's toy or an item of significance to the person it was buried with.
It's interesting because on one hand, clearly it should look like a bird, because it has eyes and it has a typical nose of a bird.
Yeah, it looks like a bird, so it's a bird.
On the other hand, the wings are clearly not bird wings.
I don't know what really constitutes looking like bird wings. Like, sure, the model isn't 100% accurate to a real bird, but it's just supposed to be a representation of one, not like a lifelike depiction.
Then the other point is birds have no rudders, because a bird does not need a rudder because of its aerodynamic architecture.
No birds don't have rudders. But birds do have tail feathers, and there is at least one species of bird which has vertical tail feathers. But that's aside from the point. The presentation of "it looks like blank, you think it would be blank, but it's actually aliens" is a pretty big part of their argumentative structure, so much so that it became a meme at one point. Just because a toy bird looks like a model plane doesn't mean it's a representation of a flying machine. I shouldn't even have to be saying this, but God knows there are people out there who fall for this kind of presentation method. Did you geniuses ever stop to think that maybe it looks kinda like an airplane because planes were modeled to look like birds, you know, aerodynamic?
In 2006, aviation and aerodynamics expert Simon Sanderson built a scale model of the Sakara bird, 5 times larger than the original.
So they go on to explain with the design of the bird, they do get a bit of lift, but it's not exactly perfect, so once they add something to the design, they're like, hey, it works now.
During the Sanderson tests, it was discovered that the only thing preventing the Sakara bird from achieving flight was the lack of a rear stabilizing rudder, or elevator, needed to maintain balance.
Okay, so after changing the design, maybe it'll fly. But then they run into the issue of how are we going to get this off the ground if it was a full-sized machine? Modern gliders and flyers use tow planes and such to get them up in the air like giant kites. So how did the Egyptians do it? Well, they launched it with the catapult, of course. And for good measure, this was a full-scale transportation system.
The scientifics of Egyptology told us that such a bird could be powered off by catapults to fly.
I just want you to sit back and really think about this. Picture ancient Egypt. Marketplaces, bustling cities, and then overhead in the beautiful sunny sky, just dozens of individual-sized birds being catapulted between cities. To be a bit cliche, they were so preoccupied with making this damn bird fly, they never thought about the practical use of it. I also call bullshit on this.
And we had a high acceptance by Egyptian scientists.
Okay. We're not even 7 minutes into the first episode. Let's get a move on.
But if the Saqqara bird is capable of flight, where would ancient Egyptians have acquired such technology?
I think that people in ancient times were visited by beings coming not from this earth, and they gave us culture and scientific technologies to improve our life on earth, coming from the primitive to a higher developed culture.
For the next while, they just shit-talk ancient humans and talk about how there are gaps and missing pieces to the puzzle of history. And they are right about that, at least. There are a lot of gaps in history we don't know because they weren't well documented or recorded. But a lack of history doesn't mean it's some grandiose cover-up to hide the fact we got our shit from aliens. As a quick follow-up, they do a similar experiment with another artifact they claim is a spaceship or something, which they turn into a remote-controlled toy plane. Sure, it works and flies, but you just made a flat-surface toy plane. You didn't replicate the intricacies and stuff of the actual brooch, so you have no idea whether the design can actually fly or not.
There is not a single insect in the world which has got its wings at the bottom. Now, when you exclude the possibility that it's an insect, one of the things which remain is the fact that this is actually, yes, what it looks like, a plane.
I don't even know what to say to that. That was so dumb, you just momentarily killed me.
So we have two examples from opposite side of the planet, and both examples are aerodynamically sound, and they fly. So to suggest that all of this is coincidence, I mean, after a while, even coincidence no longer makes sense.
Oh, you know what, Giorgio? You're right. I guess these artifacts couldn't have been modeled after flying animals because they exist all over the world. You're right. Fuck me. I'm the wrong one here. My bad. Very quickly, as these flying machine sections are getting old real fast, they talk about Vimanas, flying palaces of the gods mentioned in Hindu texts, and how they could very well be real based on diagrams and such in the Vimanaka Sastra texts. What they don't tell the viewer is that the Vimanaka Sastra has no connection to Hindu or Sanskrit texts, and was written in like the early to mid 1900s with contentions over who the author even is.
The Vimanika Shastra goes into metals that are used in each craft. It talks about electricity and power sources. It talks about the pilots and the clothing they have to wear. It talks about the food that they eat. It talks even about the weapons that are kept on these airships.
Everything in the Vimanaka Sastra is essentially bunk, most certainly the designs of how the actual Vimanas would work, as it's been concluded by multiple aeronautics experts that the designs for said machines are borderline parody of something Jules Verne would have written about. Finally, they run out of steam talking about planes and fake spaceships and start talking about airports, pointing out certain historical sites have no justifiable reason for having open areas in the middle or near cities, such as the flat-top hills of Monte Alban. It seems like we're not done with the Vimanas yet.
Could the complex set of lines covering Peru's Nazca Plain, or the mysterious plateau above Mexico's Oaxaca Valley, be evidence of runways for a worldwide air transportation system?
This was probably some kind of Vimana airport.
No, dipshit. It has open spaces on it because the buildings and structures which took up space in that area aren't present there anymore. Just because a place has wide open spaces doesn't mean it's a landing pad. You ever seen the desert? These open spaces could have very well been used for something along the likes of an agora, a place for commerce or rituals, any number of things which required temporary structures to be built in these open spaces. No more aeronautic talk, please, especially since they begin talking about magic carpets. The next segment again focuses on ancient aliens' most beloved dead horse to beat, ancient Egypt. More specifically, their argument there's no way in hell ancient man could have constructed the pyramids by themselves.
There's no reason for them to want to build out of granite blocks the size of a semi-truck. It's like, okay, let's do something, but let's do it as difficult as we could possibly do it.
There doesn't have to be a justifiable reason to you for why the ancient people would want to build these monuments in the way they did, but you can narrow it down to, religion? Along with just a smidge of nepotism. It's pretty well known the pyramids and other monuments were built as resting places for pharaohs and the elite. We shouldn't even be having this one-sided conversation.
If we go to a stone quarry today and look at the scope of machinery required to accomplish similar things, those machines are huge.
Sure, the machinery we see at quarries and building sites are massive beasts of metal capable of accomplishing amazing feats, but this doesn't mean you have to have heavy machinery to get the job done. They underestimate the sheer manpower of hundreds or thousands of workers doing the same tasks at one time. Modern mining machines were invented to replace the need for large amounts of human labor that required hundreds of people. Humanity invented these machines to replace this need because we had advanced enough technology after a point to do so. Ancient civilizations wouldn't have needed to be gifted modern technology from extraterrestrial travelers because even though they had simple tools, you know what they did have an excess of? Manpower. In order to try and support their theory of heavy machinery existing, they bring in self-proclaimed engineering expert Chris Dunn, who makes the claim there was no way the pyramids could have been made without being extremely efficient and quick.
They had to have had some efficient means of cutting them to size and putting them into place. They had to have had somebody on site who's saying, okay, I need a block this size, and then getting a block to them that size, stat, like immediately.
I'm not even going to argue with Dunn's ideas the Egyptian used giant saws, because just look at this. What I will say to Dunn's point about the construction of the pyramids needing to be quick and efficient is there was no reason to be quick with it. There was no rush. There was no reason to get it done at a certain time. The pyramids weren't built in a day, dude. While there are no exact numbers recorded, from research by actual archaeologists and accounts from those such as Herodotus, it's estimated it took over 100,000 workers and over 20 years to construct the Great Pyramid alone, with the combined construction time of all the Giza pyramids spanning about 85 years.
We're supposed to accept that the people who built the pyramids did not have the wheel, did not have the pulley, did not have iron. In fact, they had nothing, with brutal manpower and pieces of strings. The context does not fit the evidence.
When creating the pyramids, they didn't just use brute force and string, as this jackass says. No, they had plenty of tools available to them. Sleds, ramps, copper tools, not to mention the Nile was only a few miles away. The show does posit the interesting question of how ancient workers were able to cut large granite stones so intricately, and despite their best efforts to convince you an alien just handed the humans some power drills, the answer is, frankly, more interesting, and just goes to show how smart humans have always been. The theorists on the show actually explain something true for once. The use of copper tools would have been inefficient for cutting granite as the tools would quickly chip away. This leads these experts to ask, where are the tools they used for this then? Well, they're all around you, my guy. Under your feet, at the bottom of the river, in your socks, sand. Ancient workers figured out that by tracing paths of sand under their tools they used to cut stone, the friction of the sand would prevent heavier wear on the tools and cut into the granite quicker and deeper. This method could be used for drills, saws, even finer cuts made with twine. Aside from sand, workers also utilized water to compact and wet sand to make it easier for sleds to cross the fields. It's amazing the level of human ingenuity even technically prehistoric civilizations were capable of.
In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Exodus describes how the Jewish people suffered as slaves living in Egypt.
Oh boy, Sunday school time.
Then sometime in the 14th century BC, the ruling pharaoh feared their growing numbers and ordered the killing of all firstborn Jews living in Egypt.
This is my show, so I'm not going to let him take my job away from me. They're just recapping the story of Moses and the Great Exodus, how Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt to wander the desert for 40 years before Joshua led them to the Promised Land. If you don't know it, go watch the VeggieTales episode or something. I can wait.
This time, I really mean it. We should go back to Egypt.
Huh? We were in slavery.
Nothing is perfect.
What our hack frauds decide to focus on is the part of the Exodus story where God makes food for the wandering Israelites, manna, fall from the sky.
The Zohar describes what is called the Ancient of Days as providing the manna. But what was this Ancient of Days? A man? A god? Or something else?
The Ancient of Days is literally just another name for God, my dude.
The text speaks of different sized brains, different sized faces. They were connected with different tubes and different light sources. Theologians have suggested that this is the description of God.
Okay, I'm gonna be honest, I had this whole spiel written out about dissecting what the Ancient of Days was, how that related to God and the Sechina and the Kabbalah and all this theological But in hindsight, this next point is kind of gonna make that all moot, so I just cut it out. So, yeah. Might I be so kind as to clue you all in on the fact they are leaving out a very important detail of the Zohar, the text they are referencing the mention of the Ancient of Days from. It's another Vimanaka Sastra situation. Yep, another instance of using a fraudulent text as solid evidence. The Zohar was written by known forger of religious and ancient texts Moses de Leon, despite his claims it was written by multiple different authors.
When looked at from a modern perspective, what is described in the Zohar isn't necessarily a god figure, but rather a type of machine.
The mana machine was a very dangerous device. We suspect that the reactor that powered the machine was transported in the Ark of the Covenant.
Before we move on from our little Bible study, I want to be pedantic one more time. Whether or not you're religious, the Ancient Aliens crew are clearly treating the Bible as a first-hand historical document. So let's turn their texts against them. Our special little scientists, with their Ancient of Days machine hypothesis, posit this device's power source was one so radiant it had to be contained within the Ark of the Covenant to prevent illness. Well, there's one little snag in the narrative. You see, Exodus chapter 16 verses 1 through 4 detail the first arrival of manna being sent from God. This miracle was performed 2 months and 15 days into the Israelites' 40-year journey wandering the desert. The Ark of the Covenant, however, was not constructed until approximately a year into their journey, recorded in chapter 25 of Exodus as Moses ascends Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. So, the Ark couldn't house a power source for this supposed machine because the Israelites were provided manna almost a year before the Ark was built. Okay, pedantry over. And with it over, so is this episode, as the remaining 20 minutes are the experts talking about the manna machine and then going back to bitching about how the Egyptians couldn't have possibly carved stone and some other shit we'll get into in another episode. For now, were you able to pick up on a running theme? I'll give you one last hint for this first pillar the show relies on, as it kinda revolves around the base thesis of the entire show.
It's almost as if primitive man woke up one morning and went, hey, I've got this knowledge and I know how to make tools and I'm gonna go and build all these things. Nah, I don't think it happened that way. I think others came down to this planet and started teaching other people that were beginning to evolve. But the one thing I truly do not believe is that modern cavemen at the time basically created all this knowledge out of thin air.
Still stumped? Well, seems like now's as good a time as any to explain the first of the 5 pillars of Ancient Aliens. We're not racist, but... Okay, off the bat, you may think racist may be a harsh word to use, but just hear me out. Even if you're familiar with the show, you may be asking, what the hell am I talking about? Well, have you ever stopped to really think about maybe the biggest thesis point of the show? That aliens are somehow the ones responsible for building all these amazing and bewildering artifacts and monuments left behind by ancient civilizations. These self-proclaimed ancient astronaut theorists assert there's no possible way on Earth ancient humans could have done all these things by themselves. There must have been some outside force guiding them towards certain knowledge, helping them build these great monuments and artifacts. Since this thesis is kind of the show's driving force, you know it's almost always ever present as demonstrated by the several clues hidden within the first episode. To make matters worse, a large number of discussions center around cultures and other races, whether it be Native Americans or Egyptians. Something just feels off by having a majority of the interviewees white men, discussing how the people of the past couldn't have possibly developed all these ideas and beliefs on their own. Someone must have passed it on to them. It's especially egregious and offensive with something as simple as the Sakara bird from the very beginning of the episode. Who would realistically look at this little wooden toy and think, huh, well, it looks like a plane, and it's aerodynamic. The creator must have learned this from someone smarter than them. Not pausing to think for 1 second, it might just be modeled after a bird which just so happens to be aerodynamic. One thing Giorgio in particular likes to repeat is along the lines of, how did the people back then have the same knowledge we have now? Which again, if you stop to really think about it, is a dumb question. At some point in time, someone had to take the first steps into developing the knowledge of things we have now. Take star positions, for example. We only have our current knowledge because someone showed an interest in the subject and we continued to build on said interest over time. It's safe to say the exact same thing can be said about how ancient civilizations and people learned as well. The only difference is the amount of technology at the disposal of those studying the areas. Ancient humans weren't dumbasses, they just lived different lives and had access to different means of learning than we do now. And if we were able to learn about the patterns of stars in the sky early on in what we might call the modern age with the naked eye, what would have been stopping our distant ancestors from doing the exact same thing? The only time the show doesn't necessarily misinterpret or misrepresent evidence is when it's covering European or American-based history. Sure, there's still a lot of bullshit and inconsistencies, but for the most part, they absolutely love to rant and rave about how magnificent and brilliant the thinkers of European time periods such as the Renaissance were. They're nothing but absolute geniuses to these guys, unlike those barbaric ancient Egyptians and such who most certainly needed guidance through their evolution and cultural development. It may seem a bit extreme, but honestly, with this line of thinking, they should be questioning how mankind even thought to develop the use of tools. Oh wait, they do this in the first episode as well! I guess fuck all the evidence of primates and stuff using tools as well, those little monkey bastards must have been visited by aliens too. It seems humans aren't capable of innovation or invention to them. The proponents of ancient astronaut theory love so much to belittle the amazing accomplishments made by our predecessors as nothing more than things handed down to them on a flying saucer, when in reality they busted their asses off to make the strides and accomplishments we see today. I would much rather know the simple fact that humankind is capable of spectacular things which have a long-lasting impact than even consider the possibility we may have ever been visited by aliens in the distant past. Welp, 1/5 of these are out of the way. On to episode 2. As we start our second trek into another hour-and-a-half-long nightmare, we get a summary of the supposed Roswell UFO crash and our specialists talking about how vast the universe is, followed by Buzz Aldrin being honestly kind of hilariously unhinged.
We aliens who happen to go down the ladder on July 20th, 1969. We aliens were certainly part of a magnificent race.
It doesn't take too long before we jump back into the deep end as they begin to talk about ancient examples of cranial elongation found in skulls in Peru.
In Peru, we find these weird, elongated skulls. And they're bizarre looking. I mean, and these people look like aliens.
Quite frankly, I don't need to say anything as this other guy does my job for me this time, quite literally not even 20 seconds after they present the information.
One may say, okay, aliens, but another aspect that we have to consider is that skull and cranial deformation forming elongated heads is a practice that's known throughout much of the ancient world.
I think this is the first time they present information which could counter the absolutely hog-wild ideas the rest of the cast spews out. They proceed to give truthful information about George Schweinfurth and his chronicling of interactions with the Mengbetu tribe in the northeastern Congo, explaining they're just one example of ritualistic cranial binding seen throughout the world. Our only straight man here for the time being, the guy from earlier, Robert Schott, goes on to explain there could have been several reasons why they did this, including attempts to reach higher levels of intelligence and consciousness, or to simply demonstrate and distinguish status between elites and other classes. Giorgio jumps in though and says, no real discussion on my show, and steamrolls everything our guy Rob just said to spew out some more nonsense with no evidence to back it up.
In my opinion, they did this in order to mimic the gods. And those gods were physical beings, because if they were just a figment of our ancestors' imagination, I don't think that's a compelling enough reason to expose your children to such a ritual to achieve that type of look.
Mr. Tsoukalos and the gang try to convince us ancient cultures who practice cranial binding were just trying to replicate everyone's favorite little gray guys from space. Things start to get interesting as they bring in another actual archaeologist with a PhD who gives more insight into the actual cultural reasons groups might have practiced such a custom.
There are all kinds of people that either worship the body or use the body as art.
I know I'm kind of just giving a play-by-play at this moment, but this is really kind of interesting considering it's one of the many rare examples of them providing an actual argument for the factually based side rather than just overloading you with a bunch of made-up stuff at a breakneck pace. Of course, the funny theorist men have to get the last word though, not so much pleading their case as just talking everyone who calls them out for being wrong.
What's really strange is that this is found all over the world. And this is something that archaeologists cannot easily explain.
As our boy Rob Schock jumps ship for the other guys trying to now support their argument, while explanations for the emergence of cranial binding across the world may not be easy for archaeologists, it is possible. I'm gonna try and explain this real simple without trying to go into too much detail. Think of all these emerging binding rituals as something like convergent culture. Not unlike convergent evolution. Convergent evolution in nature is when animals of different species, even those in different classes, can over time evolve similar features because they've lived similar lifestyles in similar environments. A more common example used is the comparison of sharks, dolphins, and ichthyosaurs. Despite being a fish, mammal, and reptile respectively, since they lived in similar environments and lived semi-similar lifestyles, they developed similar traits, being those of elongated pectoral fins, a pronounced dorsal fin, elongated mouths, and a two-ended tail fluke. So, in comparison, our convergent cultures could have developed similar traits, not necessarily in appearance, but in cultures and beliefs, leading them to develop similar ideas of cranial elongation. In simpler terms, just picture it as when someone has an idea for something independently of another person also having a similar independent thought, but may be separated by location or even across time. Did that make some sense? Let's keep moving. Where are we going next? Surprise, back to everyone's favorite desert-dwelling country where apparently everyone who lived in ancient times was probably an alien.
Egypt. Long before the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, or even settled along the Nile River. They spoke of an era called Tepzepi, or the beginning of time. According to legends, Tepzepi was when sky gods descended from the stars to Earth on flying boats. Okay, firstly, it's Zep Tepi, not Tepzepi. The only places I've seen on the internet calling it Tepzepi are alternate history WordPress websites, so again, if you weren't already questioning the validity of their so-called sources after the whole Vimanaka Sastra debacle, there you go. Second, you could technically translate Zep Tepi to the beginning of time, but a more accurate translation would be the first occasion or the first time. And not in one single place did I find mention of any flying boats or gods coming to Earth from the stars during Zep Tepi. Zep Tepi is a name given to a period in Egyptian lore, not necessarily a how do I want to phrase it? Individual mythology. Rather, there are several different myths surrounding the time of Zep Tepi depending on which major city we're in, Memphis, Thebes, Hermopolis, or Heliopolis. While all the myths vary, most of them include mention of the gods emerging into creation from the primordial waters, the Nu, not descending from the sky.
The word God, according to the ancient Egyptian, is Neteru. It means a being that came from the cosmos.
I don't always like to be the semantics guy, but who am I kidding? I love it. Here, they're just getting wrong again. Netiro, as they spell it out in the captions, has one source I could find connecting it to the meaning of one that came from the cosmos. You want to know what the source is? Names.com. The proper Kemetic term they're looking for is Necher or Necheru. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, but this word as a name refers to, in a specific version of the mythology, the one capital G god, the godhead who made all the other gods in the Egyptian pantheon. The term is used in reference to many other gods, or names capital N though, as a sort of honorific. Like, say you're talking about Ra. If you follow this particular sect, he would be addressed as Necher Ra. Continuing on, they discuss how specific sects of Egyptian belief viewed pharaohs as descendants of or messengers of the gods, the second point having more credence than the first. The dorks discuss how Akhenaten was rumored to be a direct descendant of these unnamed sky gods they keep mentioning, and say that explains why he has a weird elongated skull, as if we didn't just have this discussion 10 minutes ago. The narrator says the Egyptian people believed this claim of being a descendant, but doesn't inform the viewer that they only believe this claim because Akhenaten himself was the one who came up with the story. Our theorists then go on to ponder why Akhenaten was the first pharaoh to insist Egyptian religions be monotheistic rather than polytheistic, eliminating the pantheon for a single god, Aten, the god our monarch in question just so happens to claim to be a descendant of. Now, you don't need to be a high-class archaeologist to figure this one out, that Akhenaten likely established this monotheistic belief in order to turn more attention towards him, which he certainly received. During his rule, Akhenaten was treated and worshipped as the god he claimed to be descended from, more so than any other simple pharaoh who was just the intermediary to the gods like those before him. But apparently he did this because he was visited by aliens who told him all this junk.
Why did he do this? Because according to his writings and his poems that were written about him later on, he was visited by one of those beings that descended from the sky, who told Akhenaten, "This is the way, I am your god."
Oh, again, I'm the one who should have totally been paying attention. That's on me for not listening in class. I'm sorry, Professor Tsoukalos. Either way, our alien aficionados continue to prattle on about Akhenaten and his supposed ties to aliens, mentioning how his physical deformities may have been signs of some sort of extraterrestrial heritage. More like ancestral heritage. While there's no familial link between Akhenaten's parents directly, it was common for members of higher Egyptian society to be at least somewhat inbred, and is most likely the explanation for the deformities seen not only in Aki, but his son Tutankhamun, whom he had with his first cousin Nefertiti. And I shouldn't have to tell you, this leads to them discussing how Tut carried alien DNA too. Look, all I'm saying is if this guy carries alien DNA, I'm glad I'm 100% human. I'm gonna quickly skip over this next section where they bring up the Dogon people of Mali, not because I don't want to, but we're past the 30-minute mark of the episode and it's a whole other rabbit hole to go down. It's interesting, but the Dogon had early contact with French and English explorers, so there's a whole debunking area there that I'm not even going to get into. Jumping continents, we meet up with some experts in Native American folklore, the Zuni people of the American Southwest to be precise.
If you listen to a lot of religious chants and songs and prayers, that's all they talk about. They're talking about space, they're talking about out there in the universe where they came from, so they depict it on a rock wall here. But the actual meaning of it is somewhere more profound and more complex than that.
They continue to rely on the narrative where, since ancient cultures discuss their gods coming from the sky, this must mean they were actually aliens who visited them, when in reality it's just kinda how humans developed religion and myths. We knew about the land before us, the plants and animals. The sky was the only thing we didn't know much about. Sure, we could see and track the stars in the sky, but we didn't understand so much about that great big void looming over our little insignificant heads. They always question why ancient cultures had such an advanced understanding of the stars and insist it must be because they were taught by someone else. It seems like the fact most civilizations relied upon things like agriculture doesn't mean jack shit for any of our interviewees here. When your crops and your culture revolve around weather, seasons, and natural cycles, would it not make sense to develop a better understanding of the sky that affects those factors? Guess not. Us dumb humans only understood stuff like that back then because aliens taught us. It's not like we didn't develop our current understanding of stuff now by doing the exact same thing or anything.
Move back a little bit, you can see another figure here. It has a dome, has eyes. There's something coming down and a nose, like a nose through the nose, but it kind of flares out.
I don't know, it just looks like an owl to me.
With all petroglyphs and things like that, I mean, they're up to interpretation. Sometimes they're just doodlings of people, but other times they may well be actual descriptions and depictions of some kind of god from outer space, some ancient astronaut.
Again with this stupid, it may be interpreted as one thing on the surface, but it could also very well be bullshit. Yeah, if we look at these petroglyphs drawn to depict imaginary gods as something else entirely, then sure, it's possible. If I think of the word hamburger to mean chicken, that would mean an entirely different thing too. I'm sorry, just Childress is so arrogant and condescending, it gets on my nerves.
Like most Indian tribes, the Zunis call these sky people Kachinas. According to the Zunis' creation story, the Kachina gods came down from the heavens to lead the Zunis to Earth through a special portal.
Sounding like a broken record again, they misrepresent very culturally significant figures, the Kachina. The Kachina are figures which don't only exist in Zuni mythology, but the Hopi, Hopi-Tewa, and Keris groups as well. Kachinas can be associated with the cosmos, as they are personified spirits of real-world aspects, so the association can range as far as the embodiment of the sun or stars to the representation of grass or insects. While Childress and Giorgio will go on to insist the Kachinas are gods, they're nothing but spiritual beings in their associated mythologies. What I'm surprised they don't touch is on the fact that the Hopi myths mention the Kachinas only visited the village in the first half of every year. Now, as we've heard passed down through the generations, there are dozens of accounts of these Kachina, these gods, appearing before the people of the Hopi, but only ever during the first half of the year. Under this assumption, we now know perhaps the Earth was some kind of vacation spot for these extraterrestrial beings, flesh and blood creatures that the Hopi believed to be gods.
All of their songs that they do in their ceremonies tell the story over and over, and that's how they pass down traditions, customs, beliefs. They tell it in the Indian way. They use things they understand to explain things that they don't understand.
So what you're saying is the Native Americans tried to explain things they saw with their own vocabulary because that was what they understood. Hey bud, that's the whole point of language. The alien gang goes on to discuss Chinese mythology and some weird stuff about how dragons are spaceships because they emit fire and people ride them, and is that a JPEG of the Great Wall layered on top of a time-lapse of clouds moving? Come on guys. I know I'm getting bored with this episode, but you gotta make sure the editors aren't getting bored too. Y'all got one more chance to reel me back in with this episode before I skip.
The Babylonian legend of Enuma Elish dates back to the 7th century BC. The story tells of how the first humans were created by an extraterrestrial race known as the Anunnaki.
And there's the money shot, folks. If you're ever planning on subjecting yourself to the tortures I have, keep this name in mind because you can bet your ass it's gonna come up time and time again. If you're already familiar with the show, 1, I'm so sorry, and 2, you know what I'm talking about. From this point on out, it's hard to go a season without at minimum 1 or 2 mentions of the Anunnaki being slid in somewhere. Those slippery extraterrestrial bastards have somehow captivated the hearts of almost every single major person on this show. Why? Quite honestly, I have no idea. They're no different in significance than something like the Kachina in terms of lore. Perhaps it's because of how old the story is, coming from Sumer and Babylon, from some of the earliest ancient human civilizations.
The term Anunnaki means those who from the heavens came.
This is just getting real old real quick, guys. Anunnaki does not mean those from who the heavens came. Just rearranging the grammatical structure to make it sound like it's a direct translation doesn't make it true. Anunnaki means princely offspring, deriving the parts of the name from the Sumerian god of the sky, An, and the goddess of earth, Key. Simple as that.
There's a lot of evidence showing that we're not alone in the cosmos and that our human civilizations on Earth have been interacting for long periods of time with extraterrestrial intelligences.
Is there?
In the Old Testament, it says very clearly, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness."
I can already guess where this is going. George here's gonna say, the big question is why would they refer to a single being using the word us? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. I believe this usage of the word was intentional, a reference to the multiple extraterrestrial beings that early humans interpreted as God.
Now, grammatically speaking, that sentence doesn't make sense because you have God and then you have our image.
Called it. When the Bible says us and our, it's referring to the Trinity.
What they meant is the Trinity, the Holy Trinity.
Hey, I mean, he is right though. But as we'll see soon after.
So basically, if you were to change the word God to gods, then all of a sudden, the sentence makes sense. And then the gods created man in our own image.
See, I told you. And as much as Giorgio wants to sound like the smart guy, you cannot interpret the Holy Trinity as three separate entities or gods as he's implying. That's the whole thing about the Trinity in Christianity is God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost, or Holy Spirit, are three parts of one whole. If you didn't grow up religious or learning about this stuff, it can be kind of an abstract idea to understand. While I don't like using the hack himself, Freud, as an example, the best analogy I can think of is how you have the id, ego, and superego in Freudian psychology that make up the overall concept of the psyche. They're all responsible for different aspects, but come together to form the greater whole unit.
In fact, the Bible says so. Life on Earth came from contact with an extraterrestrial life form. That's in the Bible, that's in ancient cultures around the world.
I'm sorry? You can't just say that and then move on like you didn't just say something absolutely buck wild.
If we need spacesuits, would aliens traveling to Earth require the same protection? Is that what we're looking at in these ancient carvings and drawings?
That is a Quincan, one of the mythological beings within the Australian Aboriginal dreaming legends and such. No? We'll have to touch on that one day.
In August 1996, a team of scientists made a stunning announcement. A Martian meteorite found in Antarctica contained evidence of fossilized life. The 4-pound rock, designated ALH 84001, showed the presence of carbonate globules excreted by microbes when they were alive on Mars 3.6 billion years ago.
Okay, so this is the last segment of the episode we're going to cover because at this point they've just resorted back to blatantly lying. The narrator asserts what was found on the ALH 84001 asteroid in Antarctica was clearly and truly alien bacteria, but this is just not the case. The results of the studies on the asteroid in question showed there were structures in the meteorites resembling fossilized bacteria in their likeness, and were therefore interpreted to be bacteria upon the initial discovery. With this interpretation, they prematurely announced they found bacteria from Mars on the meteorite, with it receiving such high publicity as to be talked about by even then President of the United States, Bill Clinton. However, only a few years later, upon re-examination, it was found these structures were not only just unique formations in the rock, but in lab conditions the same type of structures have been replicated in meteorites without the presence of biological materials of any kind. They tie in the ALH asteroid back to the concept of panspermia, a theory life originated in a single place and was somehow distributed across the rest of the universe. Bringing it back to the whole alien thing, though, the show explains perhaps life originated on Earth because millions of years ago, aliens purposely sent an asteroid to the planet containing the DNA that would later make up humans. They further justify this by saying this is why all the alleged artifacts of ancient alien presences look like human beings, because we share the same DNA with them and were made to look like them. Which, might I say, is a bunk claim from the beginning. It took millions of years for the first beings to emerge that even slightly resembled human beings. Even if our DNA was sent here by aliens, which it wasn't, there's no guarantee it would have evolved into beings who looked exactly like what the originators did. You can't have a life form developing and evolving over generations and expect it to look a certain way, even in a controlled environment. The odds of us looking exactly like aliens who would have more than likely had a different environment and evolution conditions are less than slim to none. They're completely non-existent.
And I mean it from an astrophysical point of view. We do come from the stars. It's a fact that life on Earth has been seeded by the coming of a comet containing the life matter.
Again, you can't just say that kind of stuff is fact, my dude. Whatever, we're done here. If it's not at least a little bit obvious what the second pillar is, let's get right into it with, look, Ma, I'm an archaeologist. Being interested in archaeology in general is usually completely harmless. Trust me, as a giant nerd, I love learning all kinds of new stuff about things I didn't know before, especially when it comes to history and artifacts. The issue arises when you use and twist your knowledge into something falsified or untrue. All of the artifacts shown are amazing historical pieces, fragments of bygone eras of human civilization, and testaments to the brilliance of early artistic and creative minds. Giorgio and pals, though, say to hell with the actual historical context, we're gonna make up our own story behind this artifact and tell it as if it's complete truth, because we're obviously right. This isn't just seen with artifacts, but the history of entire civilizations sometimes. These guys and gals will just promote whatever historical narrative about a civilization they want, so long as it fits in with the ancient astronaut hypothesis. They don't care about accuracy and being truthful as much as they care about being in the right and proving their beliefs. Not to get too deep, but this is a tactic we've obviously seen groups use before, twisting the narrative to suit the side they think is correct. The only difference is the group that uses this tactic has 18 seasons of a television show where they do this in almost every single episode. I get sometimes it can be hard to be 100% accurate when dealing with a bunch of information you have to parse through. I've definitely made factual mistakes before. Be that as it may, the difference with ancient aliens is not that they're screwing up facts here and there because of the large amount of information to deal with. No. They screw up facts and information simply because it makes them seem smarter. As pointed out previously, yeah, it's easy to find aliens in different things when you ignore what an artifact or painting is trying to actually convey. There's an inherent trust coming from viewers of television shows, especially presented in a documentary format on the History Channel. When you blatantly violate that trust by lying to viewers, you just continue to dig yourself a deeper and deeper hole you can't redeem yourself from. Fortunately, a lot of viewers now understand all the stuff here is bunk, but there are those out there who are gullible enough to sit down and listen to Childress, Giorgio, all their friends as legitimate historical authority figures who know what they're analyzing. I care about learning, period. And when a once semi-educational channel begins spewing this drivel, I'm not just upset, I'm mad and disappointed. Alright, chastising out of the way, next up is episode 3.
On July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission reached its destination. It was the first time in history that beings left their home and traveled through space to an alien planet.
Excuse me? Did I hear that right? No, I couldn't have possibly.
And traveled through space to an alien planet.
You know it's just the moon, right? Big hunk of rock? Nowhere as unique as a planet, whatever. Off to a tremendous start, guys. For God knows what reason, the intro goes on a whole tangent re-explaining the ancient astronaut hypothesis and detailing aspects of the moon landing, the only reason for the latter being a poorly done segue into discussing the compound helium-3, which can be found in the soil of Earth's moon. Being transparent, I have no idea why they even bring up helium-3 for the beginning of the episode. The isotope is interesting to look into, with prospective research being done into using it as a source of power, but instead the show just kinda mentions that and then moves on without much justification other than, hey, it could power spaceships, so maybe aliens did it. I know I ain't a master of segues, but it's very narratively convoluted to introduce an idea just to use it as a transition point. Even with this poorly done transition, it doesn't serve any purpose as we switch at breakneck speed to talking about ancient Sumeria again and the cuneiform tablets found within the city.
Archaeologists exploring the ancient ruins of Nineveh discovered 22,000 of these clay tablets. When they were later translated, the texts described many stories similar to those found in the Judeo-Christian Bible.
It is rather intriguing from an anthropological and cultural view, as this fact is true. Ancient texts found in Sumer and Nineveh do share a few similarities with the stories depicted within the Abrahamic religions. It brings to mind theories of how these stories spread and developed over time, how they evolved into the versions we know today. This, as you would assume, would be the logical approach to learning this information. If you subscribe to the same beliefs as these goobers, however, you would probably bring up the fact one Mr. Zechariah Sitchin had a different interpretation for some of these cuneiform tablets. In Sitchin's version of the stories, a race of aliens called, wait for it, the Anunnaki, would regularly come to Earth to mine for gold. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki needed said gold to sustain their atmosphere somehow. I don't care enough to get into the specifics of the story, but they needed laborers. So they figured what quicker way to make slaves than to hybridize their DNA with prehistoric humans to create human beings.
The Anunnaki created humans as a slave species.
According to Zechariah Sitchin, the Adamu were the first modern humans. They were created by the Anunnaki 450,000 years ago, when they genetically mixed their DNA with that of prehistoric man.
I wouldn't really be one to take much of Sitchin's word at face value, even if you are just looking at his books as misreadings of the ancient texts. Sitchin as an author was dreadfully famous, but not in a good way. He was famous for misquoting, inaccurately translating, and straight up changing the meaning of Sumerian words and phrases from the tablets he rewrote.
It's carved in their stone. This is not something made up. This is part of the Sumerian history.
Lady, it's literally a story that some crackpot who claims to be able to truly translate what the Nineveh tablets have written on them. A story about aliens coming to Earth to mine for gold to use it for their atmosphere, but a worker uprising causes them to hybridize their DNA with prehistoric proto-humans to create the species we are today. It's all made up. When summarized, it sounds like the plot of a bad young adult dystopian novel. Are Goosebumps books real because they're written down too? Oh God, I hope not. Our intellectuals here, hung up on the whole Anunnaki mining gold thing, talk about a few different countries around the world who have mined for gold and used it within their culture, thinking they did something clever by bringing up legends such as El Dorado, which, if you can believe, was clearly an alien city because it was made of gold. In another whiplash transition, they go from bringing up El Dorado in Peru to examining the Nazca Lines, an actual mysterious Neolithic remnant for once. In spite of that, Giorgio turns the conversation back around into his whole "they couldn't have made formations like this without giant machinery" argument, again forgetting the sheer power of hundreds of thousands of workers and lots of time. Even now, we don't have a definitive answer for what the purpose of the Nazca Lines were, and I posit we will likely never know. It will live a true mysterious remnant of ancient civilization, just like the Band of Holes, the next location they present. While it was a bit of a stretch for our alternative history scholars to connect the Nazca Lines to sort of mining operations, it is a bit more conceivable when discussing the Band of Holes, a collection of about 5,000 to 6,000 man-sized holes spanning a distance of about 1.5 kilometers.
They need raw material, be it gold, be it silver, be it uranium, whatever they need something. And they send something down like a shuttle. It can be a robot. No extraterrestrial is on board. And this robot just crashes over the surfaces and collects and measures raw material and disappears again.
Up to this point, I don't think we featured a clip of Eric Von Daniken. And to be candid, I've been trying not to. This guy is unhinged as hell, more so than even Giorgio or Childress. This sweaty Swiss bastard is responsible for writing Chariot of the Gods, the primary inspiration for the entire series, and the man who could arguably be called responsible for coming up with many of the arguments for and popularizing the whole ancient astronaut theory in the 60s. Which, I feel, in a roundabout way, is a conflict of interest. To have the author of the book the show's entire premise is based on? Because of course he's gonna believe his bullshit stories he came up with. It might just be a me thing, but I find it kinda weird. Oh, and his whole spiel about a mining droid or whatever is pretty out there too. Yeah, you get it. Surprisingly, again, they let someone argue against the claims they put forth, explaining the holes could be some geological phenomenon taking place over the course of however many centuries, using the idea of patternization appearing commonly in nature for animals. While I don't think the animal pattern comparison much helps argue for the point, at the very least, I'm glad they'll still take some time to give the other side the bare minimum.
Mainstream archaeologists suggest the holes were used to store grain. But ancient astronaut theorists reject that notion.
Yeah, mainstream archaeology. We're not going to listen to those government sellouts. We know the truth.
Alamosa, Colorado, September 7th, 1967. When a 3-year-old horse named Snippy went missing, her owners grew concerned and went out looking for her. Their search yielded a gruesome and mysterious discovery. Snippy's body had been mutilated, almost surgically.
I think now's as good a point as any to say it. I do enjoy topics the show covers like this, where it's just weird things that are more modern stories supposedly connected to aliens. Like later on, they have a whole episode dedicated to things like original sightings of the Men in Black and such. And this is stuff I find more interesting because, as weird as it sounds, it feels more grounded. Not that they have more credibility, but they're stories and urban legends which have modern-day connections, rather than just picking up a weird artifact and going, this kind of looks like a human but in a spacesuit. It must be some type of ancient astronaut. Is that understandable? I know I sound contradictory. In any case, livestock mutilations such as Snippy, and as they later discuss, various cattle, fall into the area of piquing my interest. There's so much we don't know about the cause, and not one explanation can account for every single example we know about. This is what makes it so cool. Theories of causation can range from the supernatural in form of alien abductions or chupacabra attacks, or completely normal reasons such as government experiments or cult activity. But now I'm at the risk of gushing and straying completely off topic, so let's see what our friends have to say about it. They did get the leading investigative journalist who covers mutilations, Linda Howe, as a guest after all.
The closest answer I've ever gotten was from a man who had had very upfront and close and personal observations of non-humans in his work for the government. He told me, he said, the best answer I can give you, Linda, is it's a genetic harvest. But once you have said a genetic harvest from Earth, there's even a bigger question. Why a genetic harvest from Earth? What is being made with this genetic harvest?
Yep, sure, and guess where we're going in order to attempt to prove that statement?
The answer to these questions might be found in our ancient past, in the bizarre, almost Frankenstein-like experiments that were practiced by early civilizations.
For some strange reason, Giorgio is the only one featured in this section, but it doesn't really matter as we're skipping this segment as they just rave about hybrids, leading to more gushing about the Anunnaki, which I've heard enough of in these 18 seasons. I don't need to re-listen to any more of this. And I can make a pretty good educated guess that anybody who believes this stuff who's watching this video is writing in the comments right now about how I don't want to talk about this because I can't argue against the evidence they show. Whatever. If you've made it this far, thanks for boosting my SEO and the algorithm. At least you're good for something. Was that too mean? I'm gonna take a quick pause in the episode because looking at the clue tally, I've already hidden 5 clues for the third pillar this far in. Hey, if it saves me from having to review episode 5, the most boring of the first season, by having 2 archetypes in one video, no skin off my back. It also kind of works because number 4 is similar to 3, but we'll get to that in a bit. Without further ado, number 3 in the 5 pillars of ancient aliens is, trust me dude! Playing off the second pillar, this third amps it up a notch, with the 2 usually being built simultaneously. In its essence, trust me dude is exactly what it sounds like. Why on earth should we question the legitimacy of information being presented to us? These guys have their own TV show, and a handful of them have written books, have degrees and PhDs, so they must know better than me. If we want to get technical, this could just be seen as a rebranded appeal to authority logical fallacy. Appeal to authority boils down to someone in a position of power or someone who holds authority believes or says something, so it must be true. The position of power in this case is the fact these guys are on television, they're on the radio, they're in books. All the stuff I listed before makes them seem like completely credible authority figures. Yet, believing a piece of information you're presented with simply because the person who said it holds a position of power doesn't immediately mean it's valid information. And I shouldn't have to say this. The show takes advantage of that line of reasoning, bombarding the viewer with different facts so it becomes more difficult to disbelieve what's being presented to them from all these people who we are told are significant authorities. This pillar only gets stronger as the series goes on, as in the beginning, this was still a relatively fringe belief, and so the show had a lower budget. But as the series got bigger, they used this opportunity to draw even more people with their appeal to authority by having guests like William Shatner, Tucker Carlson, and Stan motherfucking Lee. If you thought while I was reading any of those names out, wow, I can't believe they got them on the show, that's exactly what the producers want you to think. With this mindset, if you haven't seen the episode with a particular guest, you may be more inclined to watch it and hear how they use the guest's words as words of affirmation for their theories. If a guest sounds like they're agreeing with the show's thesis, it must have at least a fraction of validity, right? Aside from the appeals to authority, though, this pillar also consists of their tactic of stating something as fact and leaving it as such, never stopping for a moment to let the viewer or any other interviewees question it. This isn't present as much in the earlier seasons, as they do have those few and far between segments disputing the claims, even if they are short, but they definitely steamroll you with information as the seasons go on, leaving little breathing room. It's quite compelling how the fourth pillar also kinda builds off this third one, much like how this one builds off the second. You could say these three are the structural support, while the first and last are the foundation. Picking back up in the middle of a painfully long discussion of hybrids, chimeras, and extinction events, our alien connoisseurs pull yet another Vimanaka Sastra by trying to use biblical pseudepigrapha and apocrypha as a valid source.
Similar stories of intimate encounters between celestial beings and humans can be found in ancient Hebrew and Judeo-Christian testaments, often referred to as the pseudepigraph, or what many refer to as the apocrypha.
The reason these texts are labeled as apocrypha and pseudepigrapha are not just because someone decided to exclude it from the Bible as these dolts would like you to believe. Rather, a pseudepigraphical work is one of dubious origin, one which has no known or verified author and cannot really be treated as credible. In the same vein, apocrypha are writings deemed unimportant or non-canonical to the remainder of the holy texts, usually because they are pseudepigraphical. So treating these as the missing stories of the Bible would be false whether you're religious or not. They're just more glorified fan fiction. Besides, they use these works to explain how people claim to be visited by unearthly beings or angels. Dude, there's literally so many examples of that in the Bible.
Before the Bible became the Bible of today, there were many additional books that used to be a part of the Bible. They were removed in what was called the Council of Nicaea because those books contained too much information, dangerous knowledge.
The First Council of Nicaea truthfully never discussed or interfered with the development of the Christian biblical canon. The only reason people believe this is because Voltaire, known critic of the Roman Catholic Church, started spreading the rumor the Church and Council were removing texts. This next clip of Von Daniken, I don't have much to say about, but I couldn't help throwing it in, as they talk about angels breeding with humans, and it's just funny, man.
These strangers had sex with beautiful young girls on our planet. How can angels have sex? This is impossible.
Sounds like somebody is jealous. At any rate, the discussion circles back around once again to the topic of alien-human hybrids, now reviewing our main man JC, who, shocker, they claim was an alien. Please, can we talk about anything else in this excruciating episode?
The idea that ancient people, like the Mayans say, were somehow totally in tune with this and had knowledge of these kind of vast cosmic cycles, which apparently lead to cataclysmic changes on the Earth, that's the kind of advanced knowledge that we wouldn't expect them to have. And where would they get that kind of knowledge? You would think that would have to come from extraterrestrials.
Ah, there's an example of good old Pillar 1 re-entering the fray. I mean, right? How the hell did Mayans develop a calendar around the sky, a major affecting factor in their culture? There's no way in hell they could have learned all this stuff by themselves like we smart modern humans did. Those dumbasses must have had some kind of teacher. They do a brief section on how the Great Pyramid and some of the chambers within it line up with constellations, but we have to remember the position of the stars and constellations in the night sky now aren't the same as they were thousands of years ago. So while some positions for these monuments and things may slightly align with stars, when the pyramids were first being built, the constellations may have been in totally different positions than they are now.
Cholula, Mexico is home to the largest pyramid in the world. More than 3,000 years old. It is estimated that it took approximately 1,400 years to complete.
Even though the Cholula Pyramid doesn't look like much because of the overgrown vegetation, it is in fact the world's largest monument ever constructed by human hands.
Well, that's just not true. Again, the size they give may be the size of the Cholula archaeological zone as a whole, but the pyramid itself is 94,500 meters squared, or 1,016,669 square feet. This is far from the largest man-made structure on Earth, with the Burj Khalifa taking up about 309,473 meters squared. The only way Giorgio could argue against this is if he was being pedantic and brought up the points he said monument instead of building and handmade, while the Burj Khalifa used machinery. And to that point, I would say, stop it. Being pedantic's my job.
The Cholula Pyramid is by far the largest man-made structure ever created on planet Earth.
Well, never mind.
Mainstream archaeologists are telling us that all these civilizations around the world, in the Americas, on remote Pacific islands, in Asia and Africa and Europe, that they're all disconnected with each other, and that there wasn't some contact with South America and Egypt or any of these ancient civilizations. But really, it has to be the other way around. All of these ancient civilizations were connected in some way.
At this point, I was nervously on the edge of my seat, thinking Childress was going to bring up the whole ancient airport thing again. Thank God I was wrong. In place of this, the show cuts off what was probably a 2-hour-long rant in the studio and moves on to talking about UFOs and monuments like Stonehenge and the emergence of crop circles. It's nothing we haven't heard before, how crop circles are messages left behind by aliens and they're too elaborate for humans to make, despite the fact that most crop circles reported have been firmly linked to being man-made. Speaking of man-made, the next stop in this episode of Where in the World Are the Ancient Aliens? Is Belize, where we take a look at the infamous legend of the Crystal Skulls. You know, the ones they made that Indiana Jones movie after and what Dan Aykroyd drinks his booze from.
In 1924, British adventurer Frederick Mitchell Hedges traveled here with his daughter Anna to explore the ruins of the ancient Mayan city of Lubantun. One afternoon, Anna climbed to the top of a crumbling pyramid. When she came back up, Anna held the top of a strange crystal skull. A second search uncovered a matching jaw.
The Mitchell Hedges skull, perhaps the most famous of the crystal skulls purely from its connections to all the coverage in Europe at the time, was a celebrity in its own time and downright astounded all those who examined it. I will admit, it's a cool little trinket and finely crafted, but of course the history is a lot more dubious than what's presented. So let's see if our friends get it right.
The skull's appearance created an immediate sensation among the local tribesmen.
When natives saw it, it was like their God had returned. They all started crying and kissing the earth and everything. They were just so excited. And Mitchell Hedges, seeing this, he presented it to the high priest, and they put it in an altar, and for 24 hours a day, they burned flames around the crystal skull.
Nope, absolutely not. Even if the story with the natives did happen, we wouldn't know because there's no recorded mentions of the skull's discovery or subsequent return to the natives anywhere within the field reports Hedges or the other explorers wrote. Furthermore, it was later unearthed in legal documents and family letters Hedges didn't obtain the skull in Belize at all, but rather from an art auction in London, which also explains why the facial construction of the skull resembles a European woman's rather than a person from Central America. The falsification of this skull makes sense, considering most other crystal skull artifacts have also been deemed to be fake.
If you listen to the academics, crystal skulls are all modern fabrications, meaning somebody has gone on there with a wheel and has carved them as such. And this is where the big divide is between established academics and alternative researchers like myself, who feel that the academics are not using all the available evidence to draw their conclusions. And in short, we believe that the academics are wrong in their conclusions.
Well, yeah. You ever think there's a reason why they're the credible academics and you're considered the fringe researchers? Nevertheless, they babble on. About the crystal skulls and some legend I've personally never heard of and couldn't really find anything matching up with exactly what they explain, not because it's complicated, but because it's just super vague.
There's a legend that there were 13 skulls, and that when the 13 skulls come together, then something significant will change in the world.
You know, the legend you're espousing is certainly credible when the first source that appears is a website which looks like this. There is no way this website was made in 2008. It looks just a slight bit better than the TimeCube website. Eesh, one more dumb statement and I'm done with this episode.
In my mind, the evidence is there that the moon is a gigantic spaceship in orbit around our planet. It's occupied by some extraterrestrial race. In many ways, it's much like the George Lucas Death Star concept in Star Wars.
I would love nothing more than to live life just one day in David Childress's mind. Oh, it's getting dark outside again. There's the Death Star overhead. That's it. This one's done. Thanks for ending on a high note, David. And for that last clue, if you missed it. With that, it's time to unveil the penultimate pillar in our little metaphor. My way or the highway? Piggybacking its way here on the weighted down shoulders of Pillar 3, my way or the highway should be pretty clear. I've talked about how David Childress and Giorgio Tsoukalos are very assertive and stubborn in what they believe, not budging for a single moment to consider any alternative they're presented with. A lot of the interview sections with Childress are particularly guilty of erecting this pillar. This man, this 65-year-old man, acts like a spoiled little child whenever he talks about what lamestream archaeology and scientists say about his theories. He maintains any other possible explanation doesn't take into account these things that I made up in my head. Why anyone else would believe something other than what I say is madness. These guys are so cemented in their own beliefs that saying anything remotely otherwise is treated as a type of blasphemy, like you just insulted their god. The more and more I look at the mindset of this show as a whole, the more it does kind of feel like an actual cult. I mean, basically, it boils down to if you're not with them, you're against them. Childress and Giorgio are pretty petty and sometimes even hostile when disputing points that might be brought up by actual scholars. I understand being firm in your beliefs, but this is a whole other level of enforcing what you say. They'll say whatever they damn well please, and if you don't believe them, then you're just another brainwashed sheep who believes what the mainstream scientists and archaeologists want you to believe. You'll never know the truth. Sometimes there is a bit more leniency, mostly in later seasons as they move to some more topics which Childress can't construe as cut and dry as the cult of Childress wants to make it. I know this was a bit shorter than the other pillars, but, well, in hindsight, it is a straightforward one. I'm not gonna lie, I was looking forward to this episode when I first started this whole journey. Like I said before, more modern stuff is what really intrigues me about UFO sightings. With a title like Close Encounters, I was expecting them to discuss things like Betty and Barney Hill, maybe the Flatwoods Monster, even some more obscure stuff like the Hopkinsville Goblins. But alas, all that excitement was for naught, as the first 5 minutes is a history lesson on the atomic bomb. The only point of this little section is to bring up the quote Oppenheimer recited from the Bhagavad Gita.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
In an insane leap of logic and with no regard for degrees of separation, they use this to connect Oppenheimer's quote in the creation of the atomic bomb to the idea that perhaps ancient Hindu texts were referring to aliens in some great past atomic war they had on Earth. So, because Oppenheimer quoted a scripture, they're led to talking about how the ancient Hindus who wrote the texts might have been, or were at least in the presence of aliens. You see why the majority of their point connections make me mad? It's like some f***ed up logic puzzle where instead of A equaling B and B equaling C, therefore A equals C, it's A equals C and A also equals B, therefore C equals aliens falling from the sky.
They had what was called a Brahma weapon. There were many people that were singed and burned and melted by the Brahma weapon.
In the Sanskrit scriptures and poetry, there were multiple supernatural weapons collectively known as the Brahma weapons, not just a single weapon named after Lord Brahma, a Hindu god. I believe the weapon our friends here are trying to refer to is the Brahmashirsha Astra, a significantly more powerful iteration of the Brahmastra weapon. The Brahmashirsha Astra is said to be so powerful if a user wished, it could create a chain of explosions that consumed the entire universe. Normally though, the Brahmashirsha Astra was written about in terms of more subdued but still grandiose ways, with the fireball it produces creating widespread collateral damage and legends of the areas struck by its attacks being rendered uninhabitable by even plants for approximately 50 Brahma years or 155 trillion Earth years. This is all to say, of course, this similarity totally means the ancient Hindus knew about nuclear bombs because they witnessed aliens using them firsthand. One more thing for this part, at a certain point, Giorgio says this.
If you read the ancient Indian epics, they read like modern-day science fiction. Yet they're thousands of years old, with references not only of flying chariots and of these gods that had these incredible technological capabilities, but incredible weapons that they used in those epic battles.
Which just leaves me nonplussed. It's another one of those statements you really have to stop and think about. Modern-day science fiction, which he compares ancient stories to, talk about a variety of wondrous and extravagant technologies we could have in the future that isn't anywhere near considered possible for us today. Why would it not make sense for our past relatives to be able to do the same with their imaginations? Our pseudoscientific friends here discuss the possibility of ancient nuclear bombs from aliens for a bit longer, and I fail to see what any of this has to do with Close Encounters.
According to one of the stories contained in the book of Genesis, angels were sent by God to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of the sins of their inhabitants.
Instead of jumping right into and harping on their inaccurate descriptions of stories in one of the most popular texts in the world, I want to talk about something else. It's the fact they take all these religious texts and not only force in their alien interpretations, but insist every single one is reality and not just a story someone made up. This isn't a criticism on religion, mind you. It's a criticism on the fact these blockheads assert all these texts, many with conflicting stories and timelines, are all 100% real historical accounts. The actual story they cover, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, most people know at least vaguely. God destroys the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah while Lot and his family are escorted out of the city. They're told not to look back by the angels or else they'll be punished. Lot's wife looks back and is turned into a pillar of salt for disobeying God's orders. How are they going to swing this one?
When you are at a nuclear testing range and you witness a nuclear blast, you're told to look away and not to look straight into the blast. And here we have a similar description in an ancient biblical text where instructions were given, whatever you do, don't look back because you will die. And sure enough, it happened to Lot's wife.
Ah, I see. So, the destruction of the two cities written about wasn't God, but the people misrepresenting and not understanding the explosion from a nuclear bomb. Sorry, I blacked out there for a moment.
Do the stories of the Mahabharata and the Bible represent actual historical events? For ancient astronaut theorists, the answer is a resounding yes.
If it wasn't already obvious from what I mentioned before, they just outright say it. Going forward, they scrutinize the story of Noah and the flood and quite literally pull a, "But is this the true story?"
Only Noah, his family, and the animals aboard the ark were allowed to survive and repopulate the planet. But is this the whole story?
Like, obviously not if you're gonna frame it like that. I suppose you could examine stuff from other iterations of the story, like those from Mesopotamia or even going back to Hindu mythology. Remarkably, they do use the Dead Sea Scrolls to expand on the story, but not in the way you'd believe would help them. Instead, they focus on the story of Noah's birth, which, according to the Book or Scroll of Lamech, was one in which his father suspected his mother of being involved with an angel rather than the child being his. We've come this far. I don't even have to tell you what they're thinking, but for the sake of clarity, yes, according to them, Noah was an alien-human hybrid. And once again, the Scroll of Lamech is a dubious source as it is a peak example of a pseudepigraph and a non-canonical embellished biblical apocrypha, with the stories contained within literally known collectively as the Genesis Apocryphon. But of course, they're still left contemplating why the flood happened in the first place.
According to the Bible, God sent the flood because of man's wickedness and corruption. But ancient astronaut theorists believe the flood was actually a means of ridding the Earth of biological imperfections. By using Noah and his family, they could repopulate the planet with a genetically superior species.
So you're telling me, us, rather, the point of the biblical deluge, if it really happened, was to wipe out Neanderthals and anything else that wasn't fully Homo sapien. Man, you're gonna make all kinds of belief systems mad with this one.
Could it be possible that Noah's Ark was once again misunderstood technology, and Noah's Ark was a DNA bank?
Yes, a DNA bank made of gopher wood. Again, if you're taking this shit seriously, you gotta either take all of it literally or none of it. Admittedly though, kind of a rad idea. Sorta dumb when they say it, but a great sci-fi idea, and DNA banks are something humans are already creating. It'd be kinda hard for Noah to run a DNA bank like what we have today without technology to freeze the DNA. Or maybe, instead of putting the DNA in vials and freezing them like we do, Noah dehydrated the animals and stored them all inside a blue sphere a little girl and her pet alien koala dog can find in the early 2000s, and track all the now freed animals in some sort of episodic adventure.
One very interesting painting is where Jesus sits up in the clouds with quote-unquote God, and they're holding on to the antenna of what looks like Sputnik.
Nope, I'm done. Pack it up. I don't care if the episode's not over. Y'all got enough clues and I can't take this anymore. Rounding off the quintet with pillar number 5, it's the Bible was aliens. The second foundational block holding up the Temple of Ancient Aliens in the last of our 5 metaphorical pillars. While I do use Bible in the title of this one, I'm just sort of using it as a catch-all as this pillar applies to any religious text covered, not just the Judeo-Christian Bible. The Quran, the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, the Torah and Talmud, you name it, they've more than likely covered the text contents at one point or another. As we saw quite rigorously presented in the first half hour of the 4th episode, ancient religious texts are something arguably fetishized by the theorists on the show. I think a key reason why they tend to focus on things like this is because of how abstract some of the stories and wording can be, along with the existence of multiple different translations for almost every text. With so many different versions of these books and scrolls out there has to be at least one containing a passage written just vaguely enough to fit into the alien narrative. For the abstractedness part, they like to center on holy beings a lot because of the descriptions of different angels and such, which, as we know, biblically accurate angels are, well, there's something alright. This fetishization doesn't just apply to written religious stories. No, they clearly take an interest in the verbal folklore and mythology of those such as Native American groups as well. This suits their ability to manipulate stories to the narrative also, as some stories and tales have no written counterpart, so it's easier to tell a falsified version without worrying about fact-checking, as there's no easily accessible sources to cross-reference them with. In addition, the lack of solid texts allow them to, I wouldn't doubt in some cases, just completely make up stories out of thin air to make it seem as though there are tales that align with the theory. Regardless of whether you're religious, agnostic, atheist, whatever, it's important to recognize how harmful doing this kind of stuff can be not only to history, but the cultures as well. Tying back into our very first pillar, when you present these cultures as being aided by outside forces or less than what they really are, it can hurt the modern view of those people. This is especially true for groups like Native Americans and the Dogon people, who might be viewed negatively by those who believe this show slings all over its gorilla enclosure. I'm not saying this has happened on any grand scale or happened at all, but when spreading ideas and stories, it's important to remember the real-life impact it can have on people as well. This is basic second grade I shouldn't be having to tell this to a bunch of hacks with PhDs. Okay, enough of the proselytizing and sitting up on my moral high horse. There you have it, folks. All 5 pillars of Ancient Aliens. The 5 essences of what makes this show reek all the way to the last episode. Being openly honest, I'm glad we managed to avoid 5, as it is by far the most boring and shallow of the entire first season. And that's saying something for this show. Oh, that does remind me though, I've still got all these episodes rattling around in my head after idiotically electing to watch this entire miserable experience of a show. Fuck, I could have just watched the first season and left it at that. Damn it. Why didn't I think of that until now? I wouldn't have come up with the gimmick of the pillars, but I don't even know if they're a good gimmick to begin with. Damn it. Oh well, where was I going with this before I had a breakdown? Oh yeah, I need to put the rest of this experience to use somehow. So, if for whatever unjustifiable reason you still want to watch the show after this video, I will give a list of my best and worst episodes for each season. This isn't going to be a very detailed or complicated list, just giving the gist of what makes or breaks the chosen episodes. Season 1, Episode 3, Mission. This one is really only on this side of the spectrum because it did tackle some things I have an interest in, like I said before, cattle mutilations, unexplained sights. It doesn't take much quality to stand above the rest. Episode 5, The Return. Boring, empty, and just a lot of what we already know. The only redeeming factor is the first half hour or so, which talk about some actual science stuff. Season 2, Episode 13, Unexplained Structures. Much for the same reason as picking episode 3 for season 1's best, the discussion of strange artifacts and structures is interesting enough to hold my interest looking past all the ancient astronaut hoopla. Episode 12, Angels and Aliens. Nothing we haven't heard before from other coverings of the Bible. Apparently angels wouldn't have been aerodynamic with their wings, so that's something. Season 3, Episode 27, Aliens and Deadly Cults. Love me some cult stuff. We talk about the Heaven's Gate cult and other ritualistic murder-suicide cults around the world, and how some of the leaders believe they were in contact with angels or aliens. Episode 25, Aliens and Evil Places. Just plain disrespectful. Like, if you're gonna talk about Aokigahara, better known as the Japanese suicide forest, at least have the common human decency not to drag the dead into your weird conspiracies by saying aliens might have had some influence over it. Season 4, Episode 38, Aliens and Bigfoot. These guys sure do know how to play to my dumb cryptozoology interest at times, and this is no exception. I don't care about the alien stuff, but any talk of Bigfoot is largely entertaining for me. Reminds me of when I would check out the same Bigfoot Legends book from the school library all the time in elementary school. Episode 41, Aliens and Dinosaurs. Aliens caused the extinction event so human beings could live as the dominant species as some sort of extraterrestrial master plan. Also, they throw the idea out that humans and dinosaurs may have actually lived side by side. I can't. Season 5, Episode 50, Strange Abductions. Abduction stories are always interesting when done respectfully. This episode is wholly non-offensive, but also covers stuff that you may already know. Episode 42, Secrets of the Pyramids. Regurgitate the same stuff about Egypt we've heard in the past 4 seasons, but pick out the worst of it and condense it into 45 minutes. Season 6. None. To me, there is not a single episode in this season which doesn't either talk about stuff they've already covered or spew more bullshit. Every episode. Season 7. Episode 69, Aliens and the Red Planet. I didn't pick this one just because of the number. It talks about some of the weird shit found on Mars, which is interesting. I just wish they spent more time explaining what it actually was. But this episode did come out in 2014 when some of the photos were still inconclusive, encouraging weirdos like them. Episode 72, Alien Breeders. Aliens came down and fucked humans, and now we're all alien-human hybrids, and technology wouldn't exist without our almighty sperm donors. Season 8. Episode 80, Alien Encounters. This episode examines paradigm shifts in human history, which gives a nice little history lesson. Would have been better if they didn't suggest aliens were responsible for them, but I'll take what I can get. Episode 81, Aliens and Superheroes. Did you know exaggerated stories and legends existed back in ancient times too? Seems like these guys didn't, as they talk about how superheroes are interpretations of ancient beings who were really aliens. They also drag poor Stanley into this. R.I.P. buddy. Season 9. Episode 82. Forbidden Caves. They're caves. They're forbidden. Might have some wormholes or portals in them, who knows. But they inspired interesting folklore. Episode 84. Aliens Among Us. Season 10. Episode 100, Creatures of the Deep. I get my cryptozoology itch scratched once again as we review various water-based monsters of mythology, including my boy Champ, the Lake Champlain monster. Episode 97, Dark Forces. Don't try to treat what horrible people of history did with any levity. Hitler was evil, end of story, there were no aliens involved. And don't lump in Aleister Crowley with Adolf Hitler. Season 11. Episode 106, The Next Humans. Our theorists take a look inward for a change as we talk about cybernetics and transhumanistic augmentation that may lead to the next step in human evolution. It's definitely strange to see these guys so far out of their element. But of course they do eventually wrap it back around to the same alien shit we know and, well, I wouldn't say love. Episode 110, Wisdom Keepers. And Episode 108, The Visionaries. These two are tied for the worst of the season for kind of similar reasons. Both of them are outright disrespectful and or inaccurate in a number of ways. Steve Jobs was an influence to create Apple products because of aliens. Don't minimize how advanced his work was. And bring some respect to the Aboriginal Australians as well, talking about the Dreamtime and just to shoehorn in aliens. It's so much more deep and interesting than what they presented as. Man, with this and the Quinkins earlier, I really gotta talk about the dreaming at some point. Season 12. Episode 121. The Mystery of Rudloe Manor. Rudloe Manor is a strange place that ran information during World War II for British researchers. It's always been a place of semi-secrecy and mystery. I think the coverage of locations like this in Area 51 are, while not always accurate, are appealing to the sense of mystery. Episode 124. The Science Wars. Our theorist stubbornness is put into action as the majority of this episode is spent disputing mainstream science and insisting that everyone else is wrong and they're right. Season 13. Episode 140. Area 52? Gonna be up front, the season is pretty dull. Main reason I chose this one is because it reminds me of that dumb joke from the Looney Tunes movie.
Area 52. But don't quote me on that.
Oh, right. Area 52.
Episode 148, The Alien Phenomenon. This 2-hour-long pain in the ass is a mishmash of 2 other episodes from seasons 5 and 12 and some other dumb documentary that focuses on Von Daniken's work. As if we didn't have to look at him for long enough already. Eesh. Season 14. Episode 160, The Transdimensionals. Maybe aliens aren't from other worlds, but other planes of existence or other dimensions. Maybe aliens and ghosts are the same thing. They also talk about multiverse theory, and not to brag or anything, but I'm kind of an expert on that, so... Episode 152. Element 115. They give Bob Lazar a platform to vomit out all his weird rumors, and I'm just surprised it took them this long to give him his own feature episode. I ain't diving down the rabbit hole of Bob Lazar's conspiracies. Go watch somebody else lose their mind over it. Season 15. Episode 175, The Real Men in Black, and Episode 181, The Mystery of Skinwalker Ranch. The Men in Black episode ranks just a bit higher for me because they're inherently linked to aliens, whereas Skinwalker Ranch doesn't talk nearly enough about all the supernatural stuff that goes on there, and decides just to examine the aliens. Either way, two very up my alley topics, immediately going to jump to the top of the ranking for the season and the show overall. Episode 183, Aliens and the Presidents. I feel like I'm watching a documentary produced on Channel 5 by Andrew Callahan. It just hurts my head, man. Season 16. Episode 192. The UFO Pioneers. Gives insight into the beginnings of UFO research as an accepted topic and such. I know origin stories are usually poorly received, but I'll take this over the worst of the season. Episode 188. The Forbidden Bible. Just 45 minutes examining the stories of biblical apocrypha and pseudepigraphs. Reduce, reuse, recycle, kids. Season 17. Episode 194, The Lost City of Peru. This one was a real toss-up. There isn't much redeeming content in the season overall, but covering the discovery of Machu Picchu definitely beats the episodes after it. The rest of the season. There's only 2 other episodes in this season that cover a specific topic in the normal way. The other 4 episodes left are top 10s. I knew they ran out of ideas a long time ago, but resorting to top 10s is a whole other level. Season 18. Episode 208, The Shadow People. I think it's just neat to see a more obscure topic being covered. I don't really mind them connecting it to aliens as it is a strange phenomenon, but they cover it well enough. Man, my standards are rock bottom at this point. Episode 206, Secrets of the Star Ancestors. Literally just the Star Children episode from Season 7, except they omit the mention of black-eyed children. Season 19... Wait a minute. That's it. There's no more, we're all caught up. I've given the best and worst of each currently existing season. I did my time, now no more. I've spent almost 2 months surrounded by nothing but this show and these people. I can finally be free. I can move on to other things, better, less fatuous things. I guess I should, do some sort of outro now. If you made it all the way through this, thank you so much for watching. I'm hoping that means you liked it, so why not show that by leaving a like or comment and go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Was that a good outro? I got so caught up in this stuff I didn't even stop to think how to end it. It just felt like this would go on forever. And ever. And ever. And ever. And ever. And ever. And ever.
Michael, we drink and eat our garden, Michael. We protect the sacred sod in Michael. We're from the land of Nod. We don't wish for what you've got. We knew the truth, but we forgot in my cult. And the lambs just won't lie down in my cult. The truth is written on